Let me paint a picture. You meet someone and right away there's that spark. They seem deep, mysterious, maybe even emotionally layered. You're drawn in, fast, but just when you start getting closer, just when you think it's finally safe to relax, they start to disappear, pull back, go cold, and suddenly your thoughts spiral. Did I say something wrong? Was I too much? Should I give them space? Should I reach out again? You're caught. Welcome to the anxious, fearful, avoidant loop. It's a trap that feels like love, but functions like emotional warfare. The more you try to hold it together, the faster it slips through your hands. You text, they take hours. You open up, they shut down. And when you finally create some distance to protect yourself, they come running back just enough to keep hope alive. This cycle isn't connection, it's chaos disguised as chemistry. And the hardest part, it makes you question your worth. But here's what you need to remember. Your anxiety isn't the problem. Their avoidance isn't your job to fix. You can want love, want closeness, want depth, and still choose peace over patterns. The nightmare ends the moment you stop trying to convince someone to meet you emotionally where they've never even met themselves. When an anxious partner connects with someone who is fearfully avoidant, the dynamic can feel like an emotional trap that neither person consciously signed up for, but both fall deeply into. The anxious person often enters the relationship with a deep longing for closeness, reassurance, and emotional consistency. It's not just a preference for intimacy, it's a fundamental need that helps them feel secure. And in the early stages of a relationship, when there's frequent contact, excitement, shared vulnerability, and mutual attention, everything feels like it's finally clicking into place. For the anxious partner, that connection can feel like a homecoming, the emotional safety they've always craved. But what they don't realize yet is that the person they're connecting with, the one who showed up so intensely at first, has a completely different emotional blueprint. The fearfully avoidant partner may appear emotionally available in the beginning, but over time, as the bond deepens, their internal alarm bells start to go off. Not because they've suddenly lost interest or because they're playing games, but because intimacy awakens a fear of engulfment, vulnerability, and even abandonment. The closer they get to someone, the more it activates old wounds that tell them intimacy equals danger, loss of self, or emotional pain. So they instinctively start to pull away, not always physically, but emotionally. They might become colder, more distant, harder to read, or even passive-aggressive in their communication. This is where the anxious partner starts to feel confused and destabilized, because the energy has shifted, but there's no clear explanation. The sweet texts become sparse. The time together feels different. The warmth they once felt begins to cool, and it activates their deepest fear, that the connection is slipping away. That fear drives behavior. They might start reaching out more, overthinking every interaction, trying to fix the vibe or earn back the closeness they once had. But here's the problem. That pursuit, that attempt to close the emotional gap only reinforces the avoidance fear that they're losing autonomy. The anxious person sees the gap and tries to close it. The avoidant sees the pursuit and tries to widen it. Neither is wrong for what they need, but the way those needs collide causes constant emotional tension. The anxious partner isn't needy by default. They're simply reacting to the inconsistency in the dynamic. The avoidant partner isn't heartless or selfish. They're protecting themselves from something that feels unsafe. But together, this mix creates a constant push-pull energy. The anxious person asks for more connection. The avoidant person pulls away. The anxious partner gets hurt, expresses that hurt, and the avoidant partner feels criticized or overwhelmed. Then they withdraw even further. What results is not a stable bond, but a volatile dance where both partners feel misunderstood and emotionally unsafe. The anxious partner starts to internalize the avoidance withdrawal as rejection, as proof they're too much, too emotional, too needy, when in reality their emotional needs are just clashing with someone who is terrified of meeting them. This dynamic, especially in the early stages of a relationship, can be incredibly intoxicating. There are high highs and low lows. Moments of closeness feel electric because they're so rare, but the cost is always looming. The emotional price the anxious partner pays just to feel connected. What makes it worse is that these patterns usually aren't obvious right away. The avoidant partner may have had a charming, open start. They may have even initiated the intensity. But as the emotional stakes rise, so does their instinct to retreat. And that retreat activates the anxious partner's instinct to pursue. It becomes a feedback loop, a cycle that repeats itself every time vulnerability enters the picture. And without awareness of what's happening, the anxious partner often blames themselves, tries harder, doubles down on connection, hoping their effort will be enough to keep the avoidant from disappearing again. The moment emotional intimacy begins to build in a relationship between an anxious partner and a fearfully avoidant one, a subtle but powerful shift happens. The anxious partner, feeling the warmth of connection, begins to open up further. They lean in, express more, initiate more contact, and start to feel like they can finally exhale in the presence of someone who gets them. But for the fearfully avoidant partner, this increase in closeness isn't always comforting. It's often triggering. What the anxious person sees as bonding, the avoidant experiences as pressure. The more one chases, even with good intentions, the more the other pulls away to protect themselves from feeling overwhelmed. For the anxious person, emotional closeness feels like oxygen. It's what makes a relationship meaningful. They often measure safety in how present, responsive, and emotionally engaged their partner is. So when they sense distance or coldness, even slight changes in tone or texting habits, it creates internal panic. Their nervous system reacts, their thoughts begin to spiral, they replay conversations, analyze body language, reread messages, and try to make sense of the growing space between them. To regain stability, they reach out more. They initiate conversations, ask questions, express needs, or sometimes test the connection to see if it's still there. But every one of those attempts, from the avoidant partner's perspective, can feel like intrusion. The avoidant partner doesn't necessarily dislike closeness. They often crave it in private moments and feel genuine connection too. But as soon as it starts to become consistent or emotionally demanding, it triggers their fear of losing control or being emotionally smothered. They've often learned to associate vulnerability with being hurt or overwhelmed. So instead of responding with more openness, they begin to withdraw. They become hard to read. Their responses get shorter. They delay replies, avoid confrontation, or distract themselves with work, hobbies, or even emotional detachment. It's not about punishing the other person. It's about emotional survival. But to the anxious partner, it feels like rejection, disinterest, or a slow disappearing act. This creates a powerful and painful loop. The anxious person feels the distance, so they move closer. They offer more of themselves, hoping it will draw the avoidant back in. But the avoidant, already on edge from the growing emotional intensity, perceives this as a threat to their space and autonomy. So they retreat further. They may become emotionally unavailable, act indifferent, or minimize the relationship to reduce pressure. The anxious partner, in response, tries even harder to repair the connection. They may become overly accommodating, suppress their needs, or overfunction in the relationship to avoid pushing the avoidant further away, but this only deepens the imbalance. Each time the anxious partner tries to close the gap, the avoidant partner's wall gets higher. And what began as a desire for connection slowly transforms into an exhausting emotional chase. The anxious person often begins to feel ashamed of their needs, second-guess their instincts, and suppress their emotions just to keep the peace. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner may start to resent the pressure they feel to be emotionally available, even if that pressure was never explicitly placed on them. The dynamic feeds on itself. The more one reaches, the more the other escapes. Neither person is inherently wrong for how they cope, but together, their instincts trap them in a cycle that's painful, confusing, and incredibly difficult to break without deep self-awareness. The most deceptive part of this dynamic is that it often masquerades as passion. The emotional highs when the avoidant partner does return or re-engage can feel intensely gratifying to the anxious person, like all the tension was worth it. Those moments reinforce hope. But that same hope is what fuels the next round of pursuit. The anxious partner begins to believe that if they can just say the right thing, be less emotional, be more patient, or make themselves easier to love, they can break the pattern. So they chase, not because they're desperate, but because they believe in the potential they saw at the beginning. They believe that love should be able to conquer fear, that connection should be able to melt walls. But every step forward is met with resistance, silence, or withdrawal, and the distance grows again, leaving the anxious person feeling powerless in their own relationship. When an anxious person is in a relationship with someone who is fearfully avoidant, conflict rarely gets resolved in a meaningful way. Instead, what happens is that it gets recycled, replayed in different forms, through different arguments, with the same emotional patterns repeating over and over again. The anxious partner typically approaches conflict as a gateway to deeper understanding and connection. They want to talk it through, get to the root of what's wrong, clear the air, and restore closeness. For them, tension is something to be addressed immediately because unresolved emotions feel unsafe. When something feels off, they can't let it go. They need answers, reassurance, and emotional engagement to feel grounded again. But that very need to resolve things directly is often the exact thing that causes the avoidant partner to shut down even further. The fearfully avoidant person, on the other hand, doesn't see conflict as an opportunity for closeness. They see it as danger. Conflict means confrontation, emotional intensity, and vulnerability, three things that activate their deepest fears. So instead of engaging, they often detach. They may avoid the topic, downplay the issue, or physically withdraw. They become hard to reach, not just in conversation, but emotionally. Their tone becomes flat, their body language closed off, and their response is minimal. From their perspective, pulling back is a way to avoid escalation. But to the anxious partner, it feels like abandonment. It feels like the relationship is being held together by a thread that only one person is trying to protect. So what you have is one person who wants to talk and another who wants to disappear. One who's craving emotional intimacy and resolution, and one who's trying to escape it. That mismatch creates a gridlock where no real healing takes place. Instead, the anxious partner keeps bringing up the issue because they never feel truly heard, and the avoidant keeps retreating because they feel emotionally ambushed. Arguments don't end with mutual understanding. They end with exhaustion, emotional shutdown, or someone backing down just to keep the peace. And because the root issues are never actually addressed, they come back. Maybe in a new form, maybe around a different subject, but the emotional undercurrent stays the same. The anxious person feels neglected or dismissed. The avoidant person feels pressured or criticized, and round it goes. This repeated cycle of unresolved conflict begins to shape the entire relationship. Over time, both partners start developing narratives about each other that get more rigid. The anxious partner starts believing their needs are too much, that their emotional reactions are the problem, and that they have to constantly self-edit to avoid triggering the avoidant. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner starts seeing the anxious one as overly sensitive, demanding, or impossible to please. Both feel misunderstood, and neither feels safe enough to be fully themselves. Every conflict leaves a deeper emotional scar, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't truly addressed. The emotional disconnect grows wider after each episode, even if things seem fine on the surface. What's even more damaging is that this recycling of conflict trains both people to stop being honest. The anxious partner may start hiding their feelings, pretending they're okay, just to avoid pushing the avoidant away, but inside, resentment grows. The avoidant partner may start to dread any conversation about feelings because they associate those conversations with stress, criticism, or emotional overwhelm. So they build more walls, use more distraction, and keep everything at surface level. The emotional intimacy that was once so strong in the beginning starts to erode. Communication becomes mechanical. Trust begins to weaken, not because of betrayal, but because of the slow, steady disappearance of emotional safety. Conflict doesn't strengthen the relationship. It chips away at its foundation bit by bit until neither person feels like they're on the same team anymore. Instead of moving through challenges together, they start navigating around each other's wounds, hoping to avoid landmines, but never truly healing what's beneath the surface. In a relationship between an anxious partner and a fearfully avoidant one, intimacy doesn't follow a consistent rhythm. It becomes unpredictable, fragile, and often conditional. In the early stages, the connection might feel intoxicating. There's excitement, closeness, deep conversations, maybe even vulnerability that feels genuine and promising. The anxious partner feels seen, wanted, and valued. They begin to trust that this person is different, that the bond forming between them is solid. The avoidant partner in those initial moments often leans in as well. They engage, they express interest, they mirror the connection. But what's happening under the surface is that the intimacy is growing faster than their internal capacity to hold it. As soon as the emotional stakes rise, when the anxious partner starts showing more of their attachment needs, or when expectations begin to form, the avoidant partner's fear response kicks in. Suddenly, the very closeness they helped build starts to feel suffocating. They may not even realize what's happening. It could show up subtly at first. They take longer to respond to messages, cancel plans more frequently, avoid deeper conversations, or seem emotionally absent when they're physically present. For the anxious partner, this sudden change feels like the rug is being pulled out from under them. One moment, things felt safe and connected. The next, they're questioning everything. And because that shift isn't usually explained or addressed, the anxious partner blames themselves. They replay conversations, tone, timing, trying to find where they went wrong. The inconsistency of intimacy in this dynamic becomes deeply destabilizing. The anxious person doesn't just miss the affection, they start to doubt the reality of the connection itself. They remember how available and open their partner once was, and now that behavior is gone. But every so often, the avoidant partner will re-engage. Maybe they'll have a good day, feel less emotionally overwhelmed, or fear losing the anxious partner entirely, and they'll offer moments of closeness again. A text with emotional warmth, a conversation that feels open, a sudden plan to meet up or spend quality time. And in those moments, the anxious person feels relief. It's like a hit of hope. The connection is back, even if temporarily. But that return to closeness never lasts. Because the underlying emotional disconnection hasn't been resolved, it's only been paused. The avoidant eventually pulls back again, and the cycle continues. This kind of push and pull intimacy creates an emotional roller coaster. The highs feel euphoric because they're rare and inconsistent. The lows feel unbearable because they trigger deep abandonment fears in the anxious partner. And that inconsistency, over time, becomes a kind of emotional conditioning. The anxious person starts adapting their behavior to chase the highs and avoid the lows. They become hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signs of withdrawal or re-engagement. They suppress their own emotional needs to keep things good. They hesitate to speak up, fearing it will push the avoidant further away. In doing so, they trade authenticity for perceived stability. For the avoidant partner, the inconsistency often feels like protection. They aren't intentionally playing games. They're managing their internal discomfort. Emotional intimacy feels threatening because it comes with expectations they fear they can't meet. So instead of maintaining closeness, they ration it. They offer it in doses, just enough to keep the relationship from falling apart, but never consistently enough to allow the anxious partner to feel truly secure. The avoidant may even believe they are trying in their own way, but their effort is filtered through fear, which limits how vulnerable they're willing to be. And because they often avoid emotional conversations, they rarely see the full impact their inconsistency is having on their partner. The result is a relationship where emotional availability becomes something the anxious partner feels they must earn. They live in a state of constant emotional uncertainty, never sure which version of their partner they're going to get. The warm, engaged one, or the distant, unreadable one. And that unpredictability wears down trust over time. Not just trust in the partner, but trust in themselves, trust in their instincts, trust in their ability to navigate love without losing their own sense of stability. Healing from the anxious, fearful, avoidant dynamic isn't about learning how to manage the other person's behavior. It's about learning how to see your own patterns clearly enough that you stop handing over your emotional well-being to someone else's inconsistency. When someone grows up feeling like love is unpredictable, conditional, or inconsistent, it creates attachment patterns that shape how they relate as adults. For the anxious partner, love becomes something that has to be earned, protected, and constantly maintained. Any shift in energy or emotional tone can feel like a threat to the relationship, triggering a survival-level response to restore closeness and safety. But in trying to manage that closeness through over-functioning, caretaking, or chasing, they reinforce the belief that their worth is tied to how well they can get someone to stay. For the fearfully avoidant partner, the wounds often run just as deep but show up differently. They may have experienced love as overwhelming, unreliable, or even unsafe. So rather than chase it, they protect themselves by keeping it at a distance. Their instinct is to withdraw before they're hurt, to stay just emotionally detached enough to feel in control. Intimacy feels like exposure. Vulnerability feels like risk. So when someone gets close, even someone they genuinely care about, their nervous system tells them to run, freeze, or shut down. This isn't because they don't feel, it's because they don't know how to feel safely with another person. And this is where the cycle becomes self-perpetuating. The anxious partner thinks, if I can be more patient, more understanding, less emotional, they'll stop pulling away. The avoidant partner thinks, if I can just get more space, stay in control, avoid emotional pressure, I'll be able to stay in the relationship. Both are trying to avoid pain, but in doing so, they keep activating each other's core wounds. The anxious person loses themselves trying to hold the connection together. The avoidant person walls themselves off to avoid drowning in emotional demands. And in the end, no one feels safe, heard, or truly loved. Real healing doesn't come from finally saying the right thing to make the other person change. It doesn't come from being quiet when you want to speak or holding back your needs so you seem less needy. It comes from turning the focus inward, from asking, why do I keep choosing dynamics that require me to prove my worth? Why do I feel more comfortable in relationships that mirror the emotional uncertainty I experienced growing up? Why do I ignore the signals in my body that tell me this doesn't feel safe? Healing comes when the anxious partner stops interpreting someone else's withdrawal as a call to work harder and instead sees it as a signal to protect their peace. It comes when they learn to sit with their discomfort without immediately reacting to it. When they learn to soothe themselves, validate their feelings, and hold space for their own needs without needing someone else to do it first. The avoidant partner's healing comes when they begin to notice their fear of closeness, not as a truth about the other person, but as a leftover survival strategy. When they allow themselves to stay in emotional conversations just a little longer than they're used to, when they stop disappearing to regulate and start learning how to stay present in safe, small ways, when they recognize that love doesn't have to mean losing themselves, that emotional intimacy doesn't have to come with pressure or danger. But the reality is that healing doesn't work if only one person is doing the inner work. The anxious partner can learn to be more secure, more self-soothing, more grounded, but if they're still trying to make things work with someone who continues to avoid intimacy, they will still feel alone. The avoidant partner can become more self-aware, more emotionally available, but if they're still stuck in fear and reacting from old wounds, they will still keep love at arm's length. That's why the shift must happen internally first. Not to fix the relationship, but to understand what patterns you're participating in. To make choices not from fear or habit, but from clarity. From knowing what your peace feels like. From knowing that love should feel like safety, not survival.